On November 7th, a 14-month-old baby girl named Tilly stopped breathing in a California home. When paramedics arrived, they found injuries so severe, so systematic, that seasoned investigators would later describe the scene as one of the worst cases of child torture they had ever witnessed. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. The man accused of killing her had already been convicted of child cruelty before. The system knew. The system had seen him. And somehow Tilly still ended up in his care. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Tilly was 14 months old when she died. She had barely learned to walk. She had not yet spoken her first full sentences. She was at that stage of life where every day brings new discovery, where the world is vast and strange and full of wonder. But for Tilly, the world was not wonder. It was pain, it was fear, and it was inescapable. The investigation into her death revealed something far more disturbing than a single moment of violence. This was not an accident. This was not a tragedy born from a split second of rage. What happened to Tilly was methodical. It was sustained. It was torture. November 7th began like any other day in the quiet California neighborhood where Tilly lived with her parents, Alfredo Muñoz Jr. and her mother. The details of that morning remain partially sealed in court documents, but what we know paints a chilling picture. At some point during the day, Tilly became unresponsive. The exact timeline of when she stopped breathing, when her tiny body finally gave out under the weight of what had been done to it, remains unclear. What is clear is that when emergency services were called, they arrived to find a baby girl clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Paramedics rushed Tilly to the hospital. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, but the damage was catastrophic. She was placed on life support, her small chest rising and falling only because machines forced air into her lungs. Medical staff examined her body and found what no doctor ever wants to find: evidence of prolonged systematic abuse. The injuries were not fresh. They were not the result of a single incident. Tilly's body told a story that stretched back weeks, perhaps months. Bruises in various stages of healing, fractures that had begun to mend only to be broken again. Signs of blunt force trauma. Signs of neglect. Signs of suffering that had become routine. Would you have noticed if you had seen this baby in public? Would the signs have been visible to you, or would they have been hidden beneath clothing, beneath smiles, beneath the normalcy that abusers work so hard to project? Tilly never regained consciousness. After days on life support, with no brain activity and no hope of recovery, the decision was made to let her go. On November 10th, 3 days after she was found unresponsive, Tilly was pronounced dead. She had lived for 14 months. For how many of those months had she suffered? Alfredo Muñoz Jr. and Tilly's mother were arrested and charged with murder and child torture. The charges were not merely assault or manslaughter. They were murder. They were torture. The legal system was making a statement. What happened to Tilly was not an accident, not a mistake, not a moment of poor judgment. It was intentional. It was cruel. It was evil. But here's where the story takes a turn that transforms tragedy into something far more sinister. Something that speaks to systemic failure on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. Alfredo Muñoz Jr. had been convicted of child cruelty before. Let that sink in for a moment. The man now accused of torturing his 14-month-old daughter to death had already been found guilty of abusing a child in the past. The system had already identified him as a danger. The courts had already determined that he posed a risk to children. And yet somehow he was allowed to be the primary caregiver for an infant. The details of his prior conviction remain partially sealed due to the involvement of a minor, but court records confirm that Muñoz had been prosecuted and convicted for child cruelty in the years before Tilly was born. The conviction was not ancient history. It was recent enough that anyone conducting even a basic background check would have found it immediately. So the question becomes, how did this happen? How did a man with a documented history of abusing children end up with custody of a baby? How did the system fail so completely that Tilly spent her entire short life in the care of someone who had already proven himself capable of harming a child? These are not rhetorical questions. These are the questions that investigators, child welfare advocates, and prosecutors are now asking as they piece together the timeline of Tilly's life and death. Child abuse is rarely a single event. It is almost always a pattern, a cycle that escalates over time. Abusers test boundaries. They start small, with acts that can be explained away, dismissed, hidden, a bruise that could have come from a fall, a burn that could have been an accident, a fracture that could have happened during play. But the abuse does not stay small. It grows, it intensifies. The abuser becomes more confident, more brazen, more convinced that they will not be caught. And the victim, especially when the victim is an infant, has no voice, no way to cry for help, no way to escape. Medical examiners who examined Tilly's body found evidence of what they described as chronic abuse. This was not a one-time incident. This was sustained, repeated trauma inflicted over an extended period. The injuries were consistent with someone who had been hurt again and again and again. Imagine being 14 months old and living in a state of constant fear. Imagine not understanding why the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones causing you pain. Imagine crying and having no one come to comfort you. Imagine reaching out for help and finding only more violence. Tilly could not speak. She could not tell anyone what was happening to her. She could not call 911. She could not run away. She was completely, utterly, helplessly dependent on the very people who were destroying her. And this raises another disturbing question. Did anyone else know? Did neighbors hear anything? Did family members see signs? Did doctors notice injuries during checkups? Or was Tilly so isolated, so hidden from the world, that her suffering went completely unnoticed until it was too late? To understand what happened to Tilly, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The torture of a child is not the same as other forms of violence. It is not a crime of passion. It is not a momentary loss of control. It is something far darker. Psychologists who study child abusers have identified several patterns that emerge in cases of severe, prolonged abuse. The abuser often views the child not as a person but as an object, something that exists solely to meet their needs or absorb their rage. The child becomes a target for frustrations that have nothing to do with the child itself. In cases of torture, there is often an element of sadism, a deliberate infliction of pain for its own sake. The abuser derives some form of satisfaction from the suffering they cause. This is not about discipline. This is not about punishment. This is about power and control taken to their most extreme, most perverse conclusion. But there is another element at play in cases like Tilly's: the presence of two abusers. When both parents are involved, the dynamic becomes even more complex and even more dangerous. One parent may be the primary aggressor while the other enables, covers up, or participates. The child has no safe person, no protector, no escape route. In some cases, one parent may be terrified of the other and feel unable to intervene. In other cases, both parents may be equally culpable, feeding off each other's cruelty, normalizing the abuse until it becomes routine. We do not yet know the exact dynamic between Muñoz and Tilly's mother, but both have been charged with the same crimes, suggesting that prosecutors believe both were active participants in what happened. What would you have done if you were in that home and witnessed what was happening to Tilly? Would you have had the courage to intervene, to call the police, to risk your own safety to save a child? Or would fear have paralyzed you? Tilly's death is not just a story about two individuals who committed unspeakable acts. It is a story about a system that failed at multiple levels. First, there is the question of how Muñoz was allowed to have custody of Tilly given his prior conviction. In California, as in most states, individuals with certain criminal histories are supposed to be flagged by child welfare services. Background checks are supposed to be conducted. Risk assessments are supposed to be performed. But these systems are only as effective as the people operating them and the resources allocated to them. Child protective services across the country are notoriously understaffed and overwhelmed. Social workers carry caseloads that are far beyond what any human can reasonably manage. Reports of abuse are sometimes investigated weeks or even months after they are filed. High-risk cases slip through the cracks not because workers do not care, but because they are drowning in an ocean of need with insufficient lifeboats. Was Tilly's case ever flagged? Was a social worker ever assigned to check on her? Were there reports of abuse that went uninvestigated? These questions are now at the center of multiple investigations, including an internal review by the county's Child Welfare Department. Second, there is the question of medical oversight. Infants are supposed to receive regular checkups during their first year of life. Pediatricians are trained to look for signs of abuse. They are mandated reporters, legally required to contact authorities if they suspect a child is being harmed. Did Tilly see a doctor regularly? If so, did the doctor notice anything? If injuries were observed, were they reported? Or was Tilly kept away from medical care precisely to avoid detection? Third, there is the question of community awareness. Child abuse thrives in isolation. Abusers work hard to keep their victims hidden, to avoid scrutiny, to maintain a facade of normalcy. But neighbors, family members, and friends can be the first line of defense if they know what to look for and feel empowered to act. The neighborhood where Tilly lived has been described as quiet and residential. Neighbors have told reporters that they did not notice anything unusual, that the family seemed normal. But abuse often looks normal from the outside. That is the point. Alfredo Muñoz Jr. and Tilly's mother are now facing murder charges, which in California can carry a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. They are also facing charges of child torture, a separate offense that carries its own severe penalties. The prosecution will need to prove that the abuse was intentional, that it was sustained over time, and that it directly caused Tilly's death. Given the medical evidence, this may not be difficult. The defense, on the other hand, will likely argue for lesser charges, perhaps claiming that the death was accidental or that one parent was the primary aggressor while the other was a victim of domestic violence. But the legal proceedings are only one aspect of this case. The broader question is what happens next. How do we prevent the next Tilly? News of Tilly's death has sparked outrage across California and beyond. Vigils have been held in her memory. Advocacy groups have called for reforms to the child welfare system. Lawmakers have promised investigations and new legislation. But outrage fades, vigils end, promises are made and then forgotten. The real test will be whether this case leads to meaningful, lasting change, or whether it becomes just another tragic story that we collectively mourn and then move on from. Some of the reforms being proposed include mandatory, more frequent background checks for all adults living in homes with children, with automatic flags for anyone with a history of violence or abuse. Increased funding for child protective services to reduce caseloads and allow for more thorough investigations. Stricter oversight of families where a parent has a prior conviction related to child abuse, including mandatory home visits and regular check-ins. Enhanced training for medical professionals, teachers, and other mandated reporters to help them identify signs of abuse more effectively. Public awareness campaigns to educate communities about the signs of child abuse and the importance of reporting suspicions. These are all reasonable, necessary steps. But they require political will, funding, and sustained effort. They require us to prioritize the safety of children over bureaucratic convenience and budget constraints. Do you think these reforms will actually happen, or will Tilly's death be just another headline that fades into the background noise of our daily lives? For those who were involved in Tilly's case, the psychological impact will be profound and lasting. The paramedics who responded to the call will carry the image of her broken body with them for the rest of their lives. The doctors who tried to save her will wonder if there was anything more they could have done. The investigators who pieced together what happened to her will struggle with the knowledge of what she endured. And then there are the people who might have been able to help but did not. The neighbor who heard crying but assumed it was normal. The family member who noticed bruises but accepted the explanation that was offered. The doctor who saw something concerning but decided it was not quite enough to warrant a report. These people will live with guilt, deserved or not. They will ask themselves the same questions over and over. Could I have saved her? Should I have done more? Why didn't I act? This is the ripple effect of child abuse. It does not just destroy the victim. It damages everyone who comes into contact with it, everyone who learns about it, everyone who realizes that they were close enough to make a difference, but did not. Tilly's case is not unique. Every year, hundreds of children die from abuse and neglect in the United States. Many of them are infants and toddlers, too young to defend themselves, too young to ask for help, too young to understand what is happening to them. According to the most recent data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, approximately 1,750 children died from abuse or neglect in a single year. That is nearly 5 children every single day. And those are just the cases that are reported and confirmed. The true number is likely much higher. Most of these children die at the hands of their own parents or caregivers. Most of them die in their own homes. Most of them die after enduring weeks, months, or even years of abuse that went undetected or unreported. We like to think of child abuse as rare, as something that happens in other neighborhoods to other families. But the statistics tell a different story. Child abuse is common. It is happening right now in homes all around us. And most of the time, we have no idea. The question is not whether child abuse exists. The question is what we are willing to do about it. There is a moral weight to Tilly's story that is almost unbearable. She was 14 months old. She had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. She was innocent in the purest, most absolute sense of the word. And yet she suffered. She suffered terribly. She suffered for months, and then she died. How do we make sense of that? How do we reconcile the existence of such cruelty with our belief in human decency? How do we continue to function in a world where babies are tortured to death by the people who are supposed to love them most? These are not easy questions. They do not have easy answers. But they are questions we must ask if we are to have any hope of preventing the next tragedy. Some people respond to stories like Tilly's with calls for harsher punishments. They want the death penalty for child abusers. They want life sentences without parole. They want revenge.